In ancient Rome, a common punishment for enslaved people who try to run away, especially women, was branding. If a woman was caught after fleeing, her owner had the legal right to burn the letters effigy onto her forehead. This stood for fugitivis, meaning runaway. The mark was made using a red-hot iron stamp, leaving a scar that permanently identified her as someone who had tried to escape. This wasn't just about punishment. It was also a warning to others and made it easier to identify her if she ran again. It also reduced her value and trustworthiness in the eyes of future buyers. Writers like Seneca and Roman legal texts, such as a digest of Justinian, mentioned this practice. In some cases, escapees were also forced to wear iron collars with warnings like, "Hold me, I'm a runaway." Branding was accepted and routine, showing how harshly Roman society treated enslaved people. Another frequent punishment for female slaves who tried to escape was public whipping. This was a violent, humiliating act meant to scare others into submission. If a woman was caught trying to flee, she could be stripped in front of others, sometimes in a household, other times in a public area. She'd then be tied up, usually with her arms raised or stretched out, and beaten with leather straps or rods. These weren't light strikes. The beatings could break skin, cause bleeding, and leave long-term scars. Often, the overseer or other enslaved individuals, acting under orders, carried out the punishment. In larger households, there were specific areas set aside for this. It wasn't done in secret. Other enslaved people were usually made to watch as a warning. Because of how Roman society viewed enslaved women, these punishments were often drawn out and included added humiliation. Ideas like privacy or modesty didn't apply to them, and their exposure during punishment was done on purpose to degrade them. Roman laws, such as the Lex Patronia, and legal opinion from writers like Ulpian, didn't ban cruelty. While killing a slave without cause eventually became illegal, harsh beatings were still fully allowed. The scars that remained weren't just signs of punishment. They marked the person as defiant, which would hurt their chances of being sold again. Another tool used to control enslaved women who tried to escape was the iron collar. These were heavy, uncomfortable bands made of bronze or iron that locked tightly around the neck. Once on, they were difficult to remove without tools. What made them especially degrading were the messages engraved on them. Some collars had metal rings or chains attached for extra control. Others included details about where the enslaved woman belonged, making it easier to return her if she fled again. These collars turned people into walking notices of their enslaved status. They were usually worn around the clock, often causing bruises, sores, or infections, especially during physical labor or in hot weather. Women wearing these collars were immediately recognized as repeat escapees. Ancient Roman texts and archaeological evidence, including real collars found near Rome, show how common this practice was, especially during the later years of the Republic and throughout the Empire. Wearing iron collars was especially common among enslaved people living in cities, where the chances to escape were greater. For women, the shame was even more intense. These collars didn't just restrain, they stripped away any last trace of dignity or identity. In a society where enslaved women already had no privacy or control over their lives, the collar was a constant, visible reminder that they belonged to someone else. If a woman tried to escape, especially if it wasn't her first time, she risked being sent to mines, a punishment known as damnatio ad metullum. Unlike branding or flogging, this was often a slow, painful death. The Roman Empire ran massive mining operations in places like Spain, Dacia, Sardinia, and North Africa. These mines were dangerous and miserable. Enslaved people, criminals, and prisoners of war were sent there to work for the rest of their lives. Women who tried to run could be shipped off to these remote areas as punishment. Once there, they were forced to do extremely hard labor, hauling rocks, digging tunnels with basic tools, and carrying heavy loads. Conditions were harsh. There was barely any food, no fresh air, no rest, and constant abuse from overseers. Women often died within weeks or months from exhaustion, lung problems, injuries, or cave-ins. Sending enslaved people to the mines was legal and widely documented. Roman writers like Seneca and Pliny the Elder, along with official Roman legal texts, all confirmed that this practice was used regularly. For women, it was even more brutal. on top of the physical work. They were often exposed to violence and abuse from guards or male laborers. They weren't protected, just used until they couldn't keep going. Once someone was sent to the mines, they usually never came back. It was considered a final punishment with no appeal, no chance of return. For an enslaved woman who had tried to escape, this was Rome's way of saying, "You're not going anywhere again, not even alive." For enslaved women in ancient Rome, violence wasn't just a risk. It was often used as a tool of punishment. If a woman tried to flee, the consequences could be not only physical pain, but deep personal violation. Roman law viewed enslaved women as property, not as individuals with rights. This meant owners and those in charge could legally use sexual acts as a form of control and punishment. After an escape attempt, some women were assaulted immediately, sometimes by the owner himself, sometimes by others he allowed. These acts weren't always done in secret. In many cases, they were carried out in front of others to increase the humiliation. Another punishment used on captured women was forced prostitution. A woman who tried to run could be forced to live and work in a brothel for the rest of her life. This was done either in private settings or in official brothels known as lupaneria, especially in cities like Rome. These women were given no pay, no protection, and no freedom. These forms of punishment were often used to break women who had shown strength or independence. Roman writings and graffiti, even legal records, make it clear that there were no protections against this kind of treatment. Although male slaves could also be sexually abused, women face it far more often simply because of their gender and social status. The lasting damage from these acts, both physical and emotional, was deep. But under Roman law, as long as a slave wasn't killed without cause, these punishments were allowed. At the time, this wasn't seen as mistreatment. It was considered a way to keep control. In examining the harsh realities of enslaved women in ancient Rome, we are forced to confront the brutal ways in which they were treated as mere property, stripped of their humanity, and subjected to unimaginable suffering. From physical punishments like flogging, branding, and forced labor in the mines, to the sexual degradation and humiliation they endured, the lives of these women were shaped by cruelty and control at every turn. These punishments were not just about enforcing discipline or maintaining order. They were a reflection of society that saw no value in the lives of enslaved people, particularly women. The branding, which marked a woman as a runaway, was more than just a physical mark. It was a permanent symbol of her subjugation. It not only prevented her from escaping in the future, but also permanently devalued her in the eyes of others. In ancient Rome, a person's worth was often measured by their ability to serve and obey. This was especially true for women who, in the eyes of their masters, were to be controlled not only physically but emotionally and sexually as well. Likewise, the public flogging of a female slave wasn't just about punishment. It was designed to break her spirit and demonstrate to others the consequences of defying the system. These acts of violence were rarely private, often carried out in front of others, serving as both a punishment for the individual and a warning to others who might be tempted to follow in her footsteps. The humiliation was compounded by the fact that women, particularly in Roman society, were seen as weaker and more vulnerable than men. This perception made the punishment of women all the more brutal and drawn out, with their bodies exposed in ways meant to degrade them completely. Iron collars, another form of punishment, were designed not just to restrain, but to make sure that a slave's identity was clearly marked for all to see. These collars carried inscriptions that turned the woman wearing them into a walking advertisement of her status as a runaway or repeat offender. They left a permanent physical and emotional scar, forcing the wearer to constantly live with the mark of their punishment. For enslaved women, wearing such collars meant not just physical restraint, but also a stripping away of their dignity, turning them into constant reminders of failure and defiance in the eyes of society. Perhaps the most haunting of all the punishments were those that targeted women's sexuality. Sexual violence was often used as a tool of control and punishment, inflicted as much to humiliate as to hurt. The brutal treatment of enslaved women extended beyond physical violence, touching the very core of their identity. These women were denied agency over their own bodies, and their suffering was a tool used by those in power to break their will and assert dominance. For many, being sold into prostitution or forced to endure sexual violence was not just a punishment. It was a life sentence to a kind of living death, marked by shame and exploitation. In the cruelest sense, it was a punishment that destroyed their sense of self. Despite the brutality of these practices, Roman society at the time saw them as just necessary measures to maintain control over enslaved populations. It was a society built on a system where the suffering of the many was justified by the perceived benefits to the few. The experiences of enslaved women in ancient Rome show us the full extent of human cruelty when individuals are dehumanized and reduced to mere property. It's easy to look back and judge the past, but these stories should remind us of the importance of empathy, human dignity, and the ongoing struggle for equality and freedom in our own time. Ultimately, the treatment of enslaved women in ancient Rome is not just a chapter in history. It's a painful reminder how power can corrupt and dehumanize, and how the fight for justice and humanity continues. Even today, it is vital to recognize these injustices, learn from them, and ensure that the stories of those who suffered are not forgotten, so we can strive to build a world where such cruelty can never be repeated. The history of these women, while tragic, serves as a powerful call to action, one that urges us to remember, reflect, and advocate for a future where every individual's worth is recognized and their dignity upheld.